Keep the background noise down. Okay, we'll start right. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to this evening episode of Pursue. This is Pursue 15X, which is hematology erythrocytic disorder, and we are streaming live from GMCS Chandigarh via Kolkata. A very interesting topic today, which is polyclonal and hereditary sideroblastic anemia. And to speak on that, we have Dr. Saurav Kumar, who is an MBBS and an MD from Government Medical College and Hospital, Chandigarh. Presently, he is a demonstrator at GMCH with multiple poster and paper presentation with areas of interest in cytopathology, hematopathology, and oncopathology. Before I ask Dr. Saurav to start, let me request all of you to please keep your mic muted, your camera off, and please don't share your screen. With this, let me request Dr. Saurav, sir, please share your screen and let's start.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. A very good evening to one and all who are listening. I would like to thank Dr. Nadeem, sir, and Dr. Anita Dehlan, ma'am, for providing me with this opportunity to come here in front of my peers, my juniors and my seniors alike, to discuss the topic of polyclonal and hereditary sideroblastic anemias.
Please share your screen.
So my screen is already shared.
No, it's not shared. It's just gone away. Just reshare it again.
I've shared again, sir.
Yeah, now it's fine.
So to start with, I would be briefly introducing the topic. Then we'll have a quick word about the history and the classification, where we will look at after that we will look at the pathophysiology, which is pertinent to the in general spectrum of sideroblastic anemias. Then we will go in further and we will discuss the nitty-gritties of hereditaries and acquired sideroblastic anemias with a special emphasis on their clinical features and their laboratory diagnosis. So before I start, this sideroblastic anemias falls under the spectrum of basically disorders of the hemoglobin synthesis. The hemoglobin, as we all know, is composed of two parts, the heme part of it and the globin part of it. When we talk about the globin chain, then the defect can be either qualitative, in which case it will give rise to hemoglobinopathies, or the defect can be quantitative, where it will give rise to diseases like thalassemias. If there is a defect in the heme portion of the hemoglobin, then that defect can either be in the synthesis of that heme portion, which would give rise to the spectrum of disorders known as porphyrias. However, I am here today in front of you all to discuss the defects which involve the incorporation of iron into the heme molecule, giving rise to the so-called sideroblastic anemias. So before I start, a quick word about our forefathers. In 1945, when India was tallying its scores about the wins and losses, the victories and the defeats of post-World War, out there in the West, in 1945, Cooley reported his first family with an X-linked hypochromic microcytic anemia. Shortly after, in 1947, Desi and Ronak described the iron-positive granules which were present in the erythroblast in their landmark historical papers. Not so long after, a decade ago, that 1956, spontaneous pyridoxine-responsive anemias were reported by Harrison T. With subsequent advent of the electron microscope and its incorporation into the field of medicine, especially pathology, Studies revealed that sideroblastic granules represent iron deposits which are there in the erythroblast mitochondria. Almost 2 decades thereafter, in 1965, the term sideroblastic anemia was finally adopted in this landmark symposium on sideroblastic anemia organized by the British Society of Hematology. So, I start with the basic definition. In order to simplify, the sideroblastic anemias are a heterogeneous group of disorders which are characterized by the iron deposits which are present in the erythroblastic mitochondria, and these iron deposits are always and always pathologic in nature. The other subtle clues which give a clue to this diagnosis is the presence of ring sideroblast with a perinuclear distribution, especially in the later stages of development of the erythroblast. There is also accompanied ineffective erythropoiesis with increased levels of tissue iron, followed by a microcytic hypochromic blood picture in the peripheral blood. So before I get into what basically are sideroblastic anemias, let us try and define and see what basically is a sideroblast. So a sideroblast is nothing but an erythroblast which contains aggregates of iron, which is demonstrated on the routinely done Persian blue stain. Accordingly, they can be classified into three types, that is the normal, abnormal, and the ringed form. The normal sideroblast has 1 to 2 pinpoint size iron granules which are randomly distributed within the cytoplasm. In a normal healthy subject, their percentage fluctuates between 30 and 50%. Obviously, so they would be reduced in cases of iron deficiency and also in cases of anemia of chronic diseases. This same normal sideroblast, which is a very much a part of the normal erythroblast development into an RBC, would become abnormal if the iron-containing granules in the cytoplasm not only increase in number, but also in size. These are associated in conditions with the hemolytic component and in conditions, regardless of their etiology, the iron overload, which the patient might be under. A very specific type of abnormal sideroblast is a ringed sideroblast, in which there is deposition of a non-ferritin iron within the mitochondria that is located around the nucleus. As per the International Working Group on the Morphology for MDS, a minimum of 5 siderotic granules covering at least 1/3 of the nuclear circumference should be present for a pathologist to term it and classify it under as a ringed sideroblast. Practically, if this distribution in the form of partial covering of more than or minimal 1/3 of the nucleus is covered, or a complete ring is formed around the nucleus, it can be counted into the ring sideroblast. The iron-containing granules are here in also, like in the abnormal blast, are increased in not only the number but also in the size as well. This right here is the picture of the abnormal ring sideroblast, in which the erythroblast is seen going through the various stages of development and showing these abnormal blue-colored iron granules being highlighted on a Persian blue stain. Moving on, this is the classical electron micrograph of an erythroblast with an iron-laden mitochondria being pointed here by the red arrow on your screens. So why am I going on and on about the ringed sideroblast, which is an abnormal type of a sideroblast? Because kinetically, this will influence and contribute into the process of ineffective erythropoiesis. The body naturally would try and compensate through erythroid hyperplasia. On the biochemical aspect of things, the plasma iron turnover rate is increased. However, the incorporation of this iron into the molecule of heme is decreased. The red cell survival rates through random labels have been termed to be normal to slightly reduced. There is a slight hyperbilirubinemia. It's been postulated that this hyperbilirubinemia is due to the increased destruction, or that is the erythropoietic part or erythropoietic element, due to which there is hyperbilirubinemia, which is only slight and obviously routinely missed in normal assays which are routinely employed. Overall, these ring sideroblasts are non-viable and unable to do the function of carrying, unable to function the functions of which is supposed to carry within the red blood cell. In either of the cases, there is disruption of the mitochondrial pathways, which is of interest in the erythroid precursors. So each of the case that has a known cause leads to sideroblastic anemia has either minimal one or more than one of the three aforementioned metabolic pathways which is affected, namely the heme synthesis, the iron sulfur cluster production, and the mitochondrial protein synthesis. This here is a cartoonic depiction of the process of synthesis of heme. The reaction of production of heme starts with the combination of the substrate of succinyl coenzyme A combining with the glycine in presence of a very crucial rate-limiting enzyme known as the ALA synthase, which is the first enzyme in the heme synthesis pathway, ultimately leading to the generation of 5-amino-levulinic acid or 5-ALA. Here, I would like to point out that PLP, that is pyridoxal phosphate, acts as a cofactor. Now, during the erythroid cells, they have the greatest requirement of heme, and majority of them are produced by the more than 80% of the heme is produced in the body in these developing erythroid cells. This ALA synthase here is the rate-limiting enzyme in the sense that it's synthesized in the cytosol as a precursor protein, and it has a slowest activity into the chain of the enzymes which are employed for the production of heme, and hence the slowest member of the team becomes the deciding factor. Similarly, ALA synthase, having the lowest activity into the entire heme synthesis chain, becomes the rate-limiting enzyme for the pathway. This ALA synthase is basically coded by two isoforms of a gene, namely ALAS1 and ALAS2. This ALAS1 are the part of the housekeeping genes of the cell located on chromosome 3 and expressed in majority within the hepatocytes. When we come to ALAS2, which is an erythroid-specific enzyme located on the X chromosome. This here is a slightly more advanced diagram of the previously shown slide. Again, succinyl coenzyme A combining with glycine in presence of ALAS2 and PLP, leading to generation of 5-ALA. I would like to take a minute here and emphasize this fact that the first reaction, that is combination of glycine and succinyl coenzyme A with 5-amino-levulinic acid, and the last three steps of the heme synthesis pathway take place within the mitochondria, whereas the rest of the steps take place within the cytoplasm with some support in the form of stability for activity provided by the nucleus for certain genes. The expression of this erythroid gene is essential for the hemoglobin production, and it is activated and transcribed and under the action of the erythropoietin or the EPO for when the cell decides to acquire the machinery for producing the erythroid transcription factors. Now, logically, one should think that with adequate amounts of heme, there should be a repression through negative feedback. However, studies concomitantly prove that this is not the case, and this is not repressed by heme. However, an odd finding is that it is upregulated in the presence of hypoxia. In addition, there are translational regulations which are important for this gene expression, which occurs through elements of iron regulatory protein with the ALAS2 in the mRNA, shown here. This element is the iron responsive element located on the 5' of the untranslated region, and this element not only supports the ALA synthase activity, but also modulates the translation of this enzyme as well. So, number 2, the amount of iron present within the cell will also have some effect on this iron response element and this precursor of ALAS2 gene. Once the heme is produced and it is pumped outside through the transporter outside into the cytoplasm, if it is adequately supported by the globin production, further translation occurs and generation of hemoglobin takes place. However, if there is adequacy of heme which is there in normal circumstances where control mechanisms are not lost, there is inhibition of entry of this inactive ALAS2 within the mitochondria, because of which the further chain reaction for production of heme cannot begin. This ALAS2 control has a role in the mRNA expression as well as its stability. This hypothesis is supported by the fact that low ALA synthase activity is observed in the erythroid cell in cases of iron deficiency, which is consistent with the control mechanisms which I just elaborated. Moving on to the next facet of the general pathophysiology is the iron-sulfur cluster biogenesis. These clusters are essential prosthetic groups in the proteins which have a significant role in regulating the cellular iron uptake, the heme synthesis, and the iron storage, which in turn are governed by things like the iron response regulatory elements and as well as the pyruvate enzyme, which is the terminal enzyme in the heme synthesis pathway as well. These clusters are synthesized exclusively in the mitochondria via a multi-step process, subsequently leading into the incorporation of the mitochondria as well as the cytoplasmic recipient proteins. This here shows the mitochondrial pathways in the erythroblast which are affected in the various genetic defects. So the first step, succinyl coenzyme A combining with glycine. Succinyl coenzyme A being provided through the activity of the Krebs cycle, the glycine being transported from outside from the cytoplasm into the mitochondria. After that, the chain reaction starts, and finally, at this end of it, if everything goes normally, there would be heme which would be pumped out of the mitochondria. However, if there is a defect in any of this chain, it would give rise to a specific disease as elaborated below. Going on, HSPA9, HSCB defects are noted. These are genes which have a role in the mitochondrial iron clusters biogenesis, but also in their transfer as well. Now, once this genesis has occurred and transfer has taken place, this transfer goes on to hand it over to the GLRX5. If there is a deficiency of the aforementioned gene, then a pathological variant will arise which will lack the iron sulfur clusters in the iron response element protein, thereby activating and leading to repression of the subsequent ALAS2 translation, and ultimately impairing the heme synthesis as well. To some extent, secondarily, levels of phenolchylase levels are also decreased in certain amounts, as they also require a normal availability of iron sulfur clusters for its proper functioning. Say if all the production takes place and the heme is produced, iron is incorporated, but if this already raw product heme is not being transported into the cytoplasm, it is of no use, and it will again start to accumulate within the mitochondria. This is seen in cases with things like X-linked sideroblastic anemia with neurological features with that of ataxia, in which the transport defect has been implicated as the ATPase binding cassette protein B7. The third asset of the pathophysiology of sideroblastic anemias is the alteration of the mitochondrial protein synthesis. Theoretically, more than 1,000 of these proteins are necessary for the proper normal functioning by the nuclear genome and its subsequent import into the mitochondria thereof. However, even with our most advanced advancements in medicine and in molecular genetics, we are still struggling with the 13 proteins which encode the mitochondrial genome, which has a maternal, which is transmitted through maternal inheritance. Now, these represent the component of the respiratory chain complexes. Now, for their translation, this gene of the mitochondria encodes 12 mitochondrial RNAs, which are the tRNAs, and two of them are the ribosomal rRNAs. Now, this dual genetic control, that is the control being of the protein production being not only in the mitochondria as well, but as well as in the cytoplasm. Again, take a minute to step back and see the production, the first step, as well as the last three steps within the mitochondria. The rest of it takes place in the cytoplasm. So obviously, the two steps are controlled through two pathways. This adds to the difficulty in the interpretation of the pathological findings with the clinical phenotypes which are diagnosed and give rise to syndromes. If there is a recurrent respiratory chain component involvement is there, has been implicated in all of these syndromes. This may be in part affect the iron utilization of the erythroid cell, the mechanisms of which as of now are not clearly understood. This understanding is further obscured by the fact that we still lack a definitive explanation as to why these affects some tissues more than the others or not at all, or why there is a differentiation of severity or even presentation even in identical twins. Bottom line, basics for the mitochondrial iron accumulation include impaired heme synthesis, which might be due to decreased protoporphyrin production, or they might be due to impaired incorporation of the iron into because despite decreased heme synthesis, iron would be continued to be transported into the mitochondria despite the access, since there is no negative control mechanism which exists, and due to which it starts to accumulate there, and thus leads to a diseases of group called as sideroblastic anemias. Now, when I talk about the pathophysiology, I have discussed the ring sideroblasts, the increased mitochondrial ferritin, the causes of ineffective erythropoiesis. The part which is left is the iron overload. I will be discussing this subsequently in the acquired part of the classification, since there is where it's more important. So to begin with the classification, they can be classified as congenital or acquired. If congenital, they can be syndromic or they can be non-syndromic. Acquired can be clonal or they can be non-clonal. Let's dive into the congenital, hereditary or inherited forms of sideroblastic anemias first. This is the relatively rare conditions which are caused by germline pathogenic variants which affect a nuclear or a mitochondrial gene. The underlying defects have to be established at a molecular level. The inheritance, as a rule of thumb, is usually X-linked, but there is a possibility, equal possibility of it being transmitted through in an autosomal recessive or a maternal fashion. In majority of the patients, these will be confined to the males. However, in almost 33% or one-third of the patients, there is no identifiable genetic defect. I lay emphasis on the word identifiable, since what to look for is completely a clinical choice and a clinical decision, which I'll be discussing further on in the coming approach. Rarely it occurs that if it occurs in women, then it has been postulated to be a result of a variable X chromosome inactivation. The severity, despite the same mutation, varies markedly, being influenced from patient characteristics to environmental conditions to random mutations to age. However, when I talk about the frequency, the mutations of the ALAS2, that is the erythroid specific ALA synthase, are most frequently reported than any other enzyme. Now, these congenital or hereditary conditions can either have a syndromic presentation or they may have a non-syndromic presentation. If it is non-syndromic, then examples include X-linked sideroblastic anemia, those with SLC25A38 deficiency, deficiency of the iron sulfur biosynthesis, any associations with the erythropoietic porphyrias. If at all the manifestations become syndromic, then different set of genes are implicated. Examples include X-linked sideroblastic anemia with cerebrospinal ataxia, MLASA1, that is myopathy, lactic acidosis, sideroblastic anemia type 1 and type 2. Although the clinical presentation is similar, however, now we know that there are a different set of genes which are implicated in both these disorder and both these types with similar clinical presentation, and hence this further subcategorization. They can be also thiamine responsive megaloblastic anemia or Pearson marrow pancreas syndrome. Discussing the most common and most permanent first, that is the X-linked sideroblastic anemia. This is the most common, caused by mutation of the erythroid-specific ALAS2 gene located on chromosome X. This, as previously explained, is the first step, is the first enzyme and the rate-limiting enzyme in the entire heme synthesis pathway. Over 100 pathogenic variants of this gene have been described, and more than 130 of them of the kindreds or probands have been described, majorly in the catalytic domain of the ALAS2. The enzyme activity has been found to be reduced from minimal 3 to a maximum of 40% of the normal. PLP, that is the pyridoxal phosphate, is required for the enzyme activity and stability, and which is variably enhanced depending upon where the mutation is occurring. Now, this here highlights the structure of an ALA synthase gene, which has been roughly divided into the untranslated region on the 5' end containing the iron response element sequence, which has a role in its regulation, preceded by in the mitochondrial targeting sequence, and finally on the 3' end is the catalytic domain. The majority of the mutations which are reported in literature are reported to be in exon 9 followed by exon 5. However, mutations in 6, 7, 8, 10 and 11 are also there. Now this type of mutation correlates with the response of the pyridoxine. Remember, Harrison all gave pyridoxine to a few patients of then limited knowledge of sideroblastic anemia, and some of the patient responded, which gave rise to a different category of sideroblastic anemias. The mechanism now being implicated is that if that mutation is nearby this domain of ALAS2 mutation, and if in such a patient pyridoxine treatment or in exogenous pyridoxine is provided exogenously in pharmacological amounts, then they might respond, with some of them completely reversing the symptoms, while some of them have a decreased severity for the same symptoms. Moving on, if they involve more than one symptom and they present as a syndrome in the clinic. This X-linked sideroblastic anemia with ataxia has an implicated the antigen binding cassette B7, which is after the production of heme is there. Normally heme is produced, iron incorporated. Now this heme needs to be taken out of the mitochondria for it to fuse with the globin. If there's a defect in this gene, which is the ABCB7, then it has been implicated to leading to X-linked sideroblastic anemia with neurological features of ataxia. The neurological features become evident by the initial first year of life and are generally non-progressive. They can be hyperactive deep tendon reflexes and positive Babinski, which can be observed. On our side of things, anemia is usually mild and non-progressive and does not require treatment, and it is not responsive to pyridoxine, implicating that the mutation is not near the gene cluster which I previously showed. Disrupted mitochondrial iron homeostasis in the neural cells is likely involved and implicated in the pathogenesis, and this forms the cause of the neural dysfunction which is there in these syndromic patients. Clinically, the presentation of X-linked autosomal inherited and congenital forms are somewhat similar and variable at the same time. The symptoms and signs of anemia present in infancy or early childhood. If it is well compensated, then young adulthood. And if it is even well compensated, then even later in life. So one cannot rule out the presence of a congenital or an acquired form in any of the three stages, that is childhood, young adulthood, and in the late in life. However, the likelihood of one diagnosis being more common and more likely with respect to age is true in this case, like in the rest of medicine. Manifestations of these iron overload are not HLA linked, and hence they are termed as erythropoietic hemochromatosis. There can be a mild to moderate degree of hepatosplenomegaly, which can be present in the patient. Since we're talking about iron so much, when we perform the iron studies or the iron workup in this patient, we find that there is increased amount of plasma and tissue iron, the serum ferritin, and the transferrin saturation. The total iron binding capacity, since all the receptors are saturated, will be low or they may be normal in certain cases. Overall, there is ineffective erythropoiesis demonstrated on ferrokinetic studies displayed by the reduced serum haptoglobin, however, not routinely performed in routine clinical practice. What is practice in routine clinical practice is a CBC, where we find a dimorphic peak of the red cell distribution with a low MCV and a low reticulocyte count. There can be varying morphological features depending upon the severity, the mutation load, the patient characteristics, the environmental factors, or to the amount of to the extent and the features which we can see morphologically. So, for example, in the left side of your screen, this patient is relatively well compensated. Majority of the RBCs are normally hemoglobinized. However, few of them show hypochromia. On your right bottom side of your screen, you can see the anisoprocheilocytosis become more marked and more noticeable, with varying forms of RBCs being represented here. A few fragmented schistocytes are also seen here. The other cell lines, that is the TLC and the platelet count, are usually well within the normal limits. On the blood film, one can also find Pappenheimer bodies or basophilic stippling, which may be observed. These two, however, needs to be distinguished from each other and should not be confused. So the Pappenheimer bodies are basically the iron bodies located at the periphery of the cell, which have a more sparse and irregular distribution, and they are scattered throughout the cytoplasm. The Persian blue and the right stain are contributory. If a bone marrow examination is done, then one finds a hypercellular marrow with erythroid hyperplasia, with the reticuloendothelial iron showing increased amounts, and the ring sideroblast being a prominent feature. In majority of the cases, the erythroid series would be normoblastic. But since we are in Asia and India, the nutritional deficiency is quite prominent and cannot be ignored. So it needs to be kept in mind that if there is a secondary folate deficiency, there can be some features relative to the amount of deficiency of megaloblastosis, which might be seen in the bone marrow examination. A Persian blue stain is a must. Here it highlights the presence of abnormal ring sideroblast as previously described. Now, the rule of thumb, majority of it being X-linked. However, there are certain instances where the autosomal inheritance and the sporadic congenital cases have also been described. I would like to go a bit further in the autosomal inheritance. There was not much study which went into sporadic congenital cases. Since till now, only 20 such children are reported in literature with no other family member affected, and this did not warrant further study and grants for the further investigation. The autosomal recessive congenital sideroblastic anemia is the second most common type after X-linked sideroblastic anemia, in which there is a mutation in the SLC25A38. This gene codes for the erythroid specific mitochondrial amino acid carrier, which transports the glycine, which is the second component in the for starting the heme synthesis pathway along with into the mitochondria for the first step of heme synthesis. Also, the sideroblastic anemia here are syndromic with features of B cell immunodeficiency, fevers which are periodic, and developmental delay in the child which are present. There is a mutation that is TRTNT1 which has been implicated for such presentation in these rare scenarios. Other genes like HSPA9 and HSCB have a role in the homologue involved in the iron sulfur cluster genesis. Once the cluster is generated, this is passed on to GLRX5. If the prosthetic groups that are essential, these are the groups that are essential for the various mitochondrial and cytosolic proteins, including those regulating the heme synthesis pathway, that is the iron routine regulatory proteins, and the N-terminal enzyme, which is responsible for inculcating iron into the for the final production of heme. Also, the terminal enzyme phenyrochalitase has a role, which is the final enzyme. There is also neurodegeneration with presence of seizures, cerebral abnormalities, sensorineural deafness, and other multi-system derangement, which are variably present in a spectrum of patients. Early death, when investigated, was attributed to either cardiac or a multi-organ failure in the majority. Moving on to the thymine-responsive megaloblastic anemia, this is an autosomal recessive disorder, also known as the Rogers syndrome, characterized by a triad of megaloblastic anemia with diabetes mellitus and progressive sensorineural deafness. On bone marrow examination on Persian blue, there would be presence of ring sideroblast. However, there will be variable amounts of neutropenia and thrombocytopenia depending upon patient-to-patient characteristics, which one might find. The defect has been implicated in the lack of affinity of the component of the thymine transporter, which is located in chromosome 1. The gene SLC19A2, which sounds similar, but it is different from the previously discussed SLC25A38. Now, the basis for this abnormality in the sideroblast is that the thymine acts as a cofactor for generation of alpha-ketogluconic dehydrogenase, which is involved in the generation of the substrate of succinyl coenzyme A, which is the starting point for the heme synthesis, and a substrate for the ALA synthase. The megaloblastic anemia is due to the disordered carbohydrate metabolism. In pharmacological doses, if vitamin B1 is given in such patients, then it ameliorates the features of anemia and diabetes mellitus to some extent. Moving on to the Pearson marrow pancreas syndrome. This is characterized by severe sideroblastic anemia. Milder neutropenia and thrombocytopenia may accompany, along with presence of pancreatic insufficiency, lactic acidosis, and failure to thrive from infancy or earlier childhood. Depending upon the severity, the age of the presentation shall also vary. The symptoms are usually progressive, and a congenital multisystem disorder which is caused by these large deletions or rearrangements basically in the mitochondrial DNA result in the loss of these multiple proteins which are encoded by the transfer RNAs within the mitochondrial genomes. The defect has been postulated in being in the respiratory enzyme defects. However, the proof is not very definite as of now. Clinically, there can be a variable degree of myopathy which can be present along with the features of hepatic or renal failure, which may be evident on LFTs and RFTs depending upon the stage at which the patient is presenting. This right here in the top right and top left of your corner of your screens in panel A and B, You can see right gyms are stained erythroid and myeloid precursors showing numerous cytoplasmic vacuolations which are prominent. Putting a Persian blue stain in panel C and D, the ring sideroblast, as previously discussed, are highlighted. Moving on to MLASA1, that is myopathy with lactic acidosis with sideroblastic anemia, known as Kearns-Sayre syndrome, which is relatively a milder form of mitochondrial cytopathy, which is associated with the above aforementioned features. This has an autosomal recessive pattern of inheritance, and it's a relatively rare disease which manifests. This involves oxidative phosphorylation and the iron metabolism, which is affected and implicated in the pathophysiology of this syndrome. The candidate gene as of now is believed to be localized on chromosome 12, having a missense mutation in the pseudouridine synthase, that is the PUS1 gene. The myopathy and anemia which usually accompany are in majority progressive in nature. The MLSA part 2 is the patient presenting with clinical features which are similar. However, this form is slightly more severe in comparison to MLSA1. Probably one of the reasons being that the homeline germline mutations are reported in not only the PUS1 gene, but also next commonly as in the YARS2, IARS2, LARS2, which are inherited in an autosomal recessive fashion. There are other genes which are being discovered now, that is MT-ATP6, which is an X-linked, which has an X-linked pattern of inheritance, and also the NDUFB11, which is inherited maternally. Typically, the child would present with progressive exercise intolerance during childhood. The onset of the anemia would usually around the age around the adolescence, when the metabolic requirements of any human being increase, and hence a stress is generated on the multiple systems. This here on the top right and left corners, panel A and B, you can see the Pappenheimer bodies, not to be confused with basophilic stippling. The lower panels C in subsequent different magnifications in D and E shows vacuolations which are present in the normoblasts and the erythroblasts in the red cell precursors. The same inclusions are highlighted when demonstrated and confirmed of being iron when demonstrated, and a Persian blue reaction stain is done. Now this ends the part of the congenital sideroblastic anemias. Moving on to the classification with acquired sideroblastic anemias, it can be primary, clonal, or neoplastic, which has MPN on, that is myeloproliferative neoplasm, on one end of the spectrum, and myelodysplastic syndrome on the other, and the MDS MPN overlap syndrome somewhere in the middle. Depending upon this, they can be further subclassified into these three types. However, I would not be taking these up in detail for purpose of limited time. Non-clonal, secondary, or reversible metabolic can be due to things like drugs like alcohol, or drugs like isoniazid, pyrazinamide, progesterone, etc. There can be nutritional deficiencies which include deficiency of copper or toxicity with zinc. Hypothermia also leads to, in some cases, reversible sideroblastic anemia. Epidemiologically, these are relatively more common in comparison to the congenital forms, having an incidence rate of 1 to 2 lakh 1 to 2 patients per lakh population per year. The incidence being 10 times in patients with years above 70 years of age, with an incidence rate of 10 to 15 patients per lakh population per year. These are the various MDS and myelodysplastic syndromes in which the ring sideroblast can be demonstrated. However, because of limited time, I would not be going into this part of the talk in today. Next is what we left in the congenital part, the process of iron overload. I discuss it here in acquired since here it is more relevant. So the iron overload has a capacity when the capacity of the serum transferrin is exceeded, then the iron no more iron can bind, which results to in the non-transferrin bound iron circulating within the plasma, which would either excess iron with this excess iron being initially promoted into the generation of the free hydroxyl radicals, or they'll form insoluble complexes which will be deposited in the tissues, ultimately resulting in end organ damage and toxicity. The clinical features would vary from cardiac failure to liver cirrhosis to diabetes to infertility to growth failure. Now, ideally, things like iron overload should not develop only in the patient. However, practically, this is not possible. The result is that the ineffective erythropoiesis or the patient is highly dependent on transfusions. There is mild to moderate degree of hepatosplenomegaly, which is associated and is a common finding. The LFTs are in majority normal or only mildly disturbed, if at all they are deranged. A liver biopsy, when conducted, shows an iron deposition which is indistinguishable from that of the findings of the hereditary hemochromatosis. This here is a HNE section of liver in which the patient was finally reported to have an autosomal recessive congenital sideroblastic anemia with a moderate amount of iron overload. On the bottom right corner of your screens, you can see the blue iron being deposited and being demonstrated in the liver through a Persian blue reaction. In cases of patients presenting with X-linked sideroblastic anemia, there is some association which has been found with multinodular cirrhosis, micronodular cirrhosis, which is often asymptomatic. And hence it is discovered late in life, that is by the third and fourth decade. The severity of the involvement of the cirrhosis does not correlate with the severity of the anemia with which the patient presents. There are isolated case reports which report the development of hepatocellular carcinoma with patients having a diagnosed X-linked sideroblastic anemia and eventually developing cirrhosis of the liver. However, these are rare, and for practical purposes, this has a low malignant potential. The same iron overload is highlighted in the Persian blue stain in the bottom right corner of your screens. The pattern of iron deposition being slightly different and being altered due to the morphological changes in the liver due to cirrhosis. If at all the cardiac complications occur, then these are often late in nature, and when they occur, they usually have a fatal outcome. They can rise from arrhythmia, which might be correctable to a particular point, ultimately resulting in heart failure and subsequent death. The various iron overload granules are being demonstrated in this cardiac section on which a Persian blue reaction stain has been done. We cannot move on to and end this topic without discussing the natural history of what would happen if the patient is not treated and if it's let be, he's let be. Then naturally the patients usually have a chronic anemia which is generally stable. Sometimes, though rarely, it may progress to marrow failure or a leukemic conversion, that is a second hit. The first hit being an already altered mutation giving rise to manifestations of sideroblastic anemia. The leukemic evolution becomes more likely in cases when the sideroblastic anemia is accompanied by dysplasia, or there is other cell lineages which are involved, that is, there is depression of the thrombocytes, or there is leukopenia, or there is reticulocytopenia. When the patient presents to the hospital, at this time, majority of them are dependent upon transfusions. There are few ring sideroblasts which can be demonstrated, the predominance of them being in the intermediate sideroblast. Abnormal bone karyotype further increases risk, like monosomy 7 and deletion 20q. If the sideroblastic anemia might become unmasked when the patient is undergoing therapy for some other non-related malignant disorder. Moving on to the reversible sideroblastic anemia, number one cause being alcohol, which inhibits the synthesis of heme and the hepatic mitochondrial protein synthesis. There is decreased activity, chiefly reported in the erythrocyte ALA dehydratase, which is the next enzyme, which is the first cytosolic enzyme in the heme production pathway. There is also depression of phenylokinase, leukocyte copper-pyrogen oxidase, and uroporphyrogen decarboxylase. However, as opposed to the congenital forms and the acquired congenital forms, there is an increased activity of ALA synthase along with probilinogen deaminase. Anemia occurs with the presence of malnutrition and folate deficiency. There are some abnormalities in the B6 metabolism which have been implicated. In the bone marrow, as with the congenital and other forms of sideroblastic anemia, there is hypercellularity with the erythroid hyperplasia. The erythroid seedings being normoblastic, and virtually it's indistinguishable from the other previously discussed forms. A subtle clue can be there can be vacuolizations of the pronormoblasts in these cases. There can be demonstration of ring sideroblasts which have a wide, broad range ranging from 10 to 70%, typically presenting in the late normoblast. The bone marrow iron stores are usually found to be increased in majority of the patients. If alcohol is subsequently withdrawn, then in the lab it can be demonstrated that the ring sideroblast would disappear within a few days to approximately 2 weeks. This recovery can be further monitored less invasively through reticulocytosis, and if indicated, erythroid hyperplasia can also be demonstrated. Since we are sitting in Asia, and that too in India, it would be wrong for me not to have a word about antitubercular drugs. Very commonly employed with a high incidence rate, especially in Asia, especially in India, the ATT drugs interfere with the B6 metabolism and they result in sideroblastic anemia in certain cases. Most commonly implicated drug is isoniazid, followed by pyrazinamide and cycloserine. The pathogenesis being that it interferes with the metabolism of B6, which would decrease the pyridoxal phosphate, which is a cofactor required in the first step of heme synthesis. And since this cofactor is not available, the reaction cannot proceed further and the heme cannot be produced. This isoniazid inhibits the ALA synthase activity in a dose-dependent manner. That is, more the dose, the higher the toxicity, the earlier the patient or the earlier the suppression will take place. Anemia would typically develop after 1 to 10 months after institution of the isoniazid therapy. In the bone marrow, one can demonstrate ring sideroblasts through Persian blue stain. Treatment is obviously to withdraw the drug as per Western literature. However, dose alteration and regime alterations are the way to go as far as Asia and India is concerned. Adequate doses of vitamin B6 are added along with ATT if the patient can tolerate and the other patient characteristics are supportive. Anemia becomes fully reversed on drug withdrawal or addition of a larger dose of the pyridoxine which the patient is subsequently receiving. Next commonly employed drugs include chloramphenicol and linezolid. These inhibit the mitochondrial protein synthesis basically in the translational aspect of the 70S chromosomes. The serine and glycine in the erythroid mitochondria, the glycine being another starting product along with succinyl coenzyme A in production of heme, inhibits the synthesis of the subsequent lower down the chain mitochondrial membrane proteins like cytochrome A, A3, and B. There is accompanied reticulocytopenia along with increased serum iron levels and prolonged plasma iron clearance, which are characteristic for these type of toxicity. There can also be deficiency of copper, which is reported along with variable degrees of neutropenia that may be misdiagnosed as an MDS variant. Associations with the prolonged paternal nutrition, post-op gastrectomy, forced arterial bleeding, copper chelating drugs, zinc supplementations for various indications further aggravate the condition and development of the copper deficiency. If at all the deficiency does happen, then there is an impaired intestinal absorption and mobilization of iron from the reticuloendothelial cells to transferrin. That is the lack of ceruloplasmin ferroxidase. So, as a result, there is a defective ferric to ferrous conversion implicated due to low levels of cytochrome oxidase. On performing a bone marrow, one finds it to be hypoplastic, with vacuolizations being demonstrated in the early erythroid and the granulocyte precursors. This right here shows the increase in the hematogones, which are the lymphoid cells in the bone marrow aspirate smears, which are a characteristic of copper deficiency, and they have been proposed by some authors to distinguish copper deficiency from the myelodysplastic syndromes. The arrow here highlights the cytoplasmic vacuolation in an erythroid precursor. Hypothermia can also lead to reversible cytoplastic anemia, basically by inhibiting the protein translation into the mitochondria, subsequently decreasing heme synthesis and iron incorporation, followed by a compensatory attempt of the body by erythroid hyperplasia and demonstration of ring sideroblast if at all a bone marrow examination is conducted. There can be variable degrees of thrombocytopenias, which can be associated despite a normal number of megakaryocytes being demonstrated in the bone marrow aspirate. The anemia is reversible in cases of lead poisoning, in which the most likely implicating factor initially was ingestion of PAID. However, by the global ban of lead-based paints worldwide, the incidence of this type of etiology is subsequently reducing. However, there are still some factories or occupational hazards which employ lead as an active element. Example include like that of the battery industry. So there can be an occupational exposure. There can be some in certain areas of the world in which the water transport is still being done through the lead pipes. And hence, in these cases, lead poisoning needs to be considered as an effective differential diagnosis. The pathogenesis of this type of poisoning leads to binding of the sulfur hydroxyl group, which are present in the various enzymes which are required for the normal functioning of the normal cell milieu. This inhibits the ALA dehydratase and globin synthesis as well. There is an inhibition of red cell pyrimidine 5 nucleotidase activity with a direct injury to the red cell membrane occurring and resulting into hemolysis. Clinically, the patient would have progressive pallor along with presentation of lead or lead lines on the gums, which may or may not be present, which are directly proportional to the amount of toxicity which the patient is undergoing. They can be associated abdominal pain due to autonomic neuropathy, or they can be features of motor neuropathy or psychiatric problems, memory loss, and headache. Hematologically, on our side of things, we'll find anemia which will range from mild to moderate degree depending upon the extent and severity of exposure. The blood film typically would show hyperchromia along with microcytosis. There can be prominent basophilic stippling, which can be demonstrated in few of the cases due to aggregated ribosomes. So one must look for it. There can be mild hemolysis, which can occur and with subtle hints like polychromasia, elevated retic count, dimorphism, etc. In the bone marrow, again, one finds erythroid hyperplasia, ring sideroblast, and which are uncommon. The treatment includes removal of the lead exposure or chelating drugs. So, almost ending my topic, how do I basically approach this patient, or if I'm considering it for a sideroblastic anemia? Often this is the diagnosis of exclusion, which is considered in the differential diagnosis with unexplained anemias, which after more common causes like iron deficiency or thalassemia have been ruled out. There can be telltale ring sideroblast on the bone marrow aspirate smear, which can be present. A distinction of the clinical phenotype versus genotype is to be determined via genetic testing. The associated clinical features in some of the syndromic forms occur in large variability, and they do not fully manifest at presentation, and they can be missed. This here is the recap of the previous classification which we discussed. The When evaluating a child or a young adult less than 20 years in evaluation, one needs to have a lack of other diagnoses in majority of the cases, very permanently taking care and taking the history of family clinical features that suggest or rule out other syndromic conditions which are relatively more common. On the blood film, there will be microcytic hyperchromic blood picture, but before classifying it as or considering the possibility of sideroblastic anemia, more common possibilities like iron deficiency or thalassemias should be ruled out first, and only in their absence, which is well documented, can one think or suggest the possibility of sideroblastic anemia. Less commonly, there can be syndromic forms of congenital sideroblastic anemias, which can be microcytic or normocytic or macrocytic. It is reversible in cases. Reversible sideroblastic anemia is extremely rare and unlikely to be encountered, especially in cases of children. The mode of transmission can be there, and there is no transmission which is observed from no transmission to sons from fathers, which has been linked, especially if the implicated mechanism is an X-linked. It's worth keeping in mind here that there can be X-linked sideroblastic anemia, which can be transmitted from mother to fathers as daughters from mothers or fathers as well. Ultimately, to particularly put a pin on a specific diagnosis, one needs it to be ultimately confirmation with the DNA analysis, the clinical phenotype dictating which gene to prioritize for mutational analysis. Other likely gene candidates which are to be tested would determine upon the primary panel of genes which are tested. The failure to such find a mutation does not eliminate the possibility of a congenital sideroblastic anemia, since I want to remind you that there is 1/3 of the population in which there is no identifiable genetic defect, emphasis on the word identifiable, which can be demonstrated in patients who are being evaluated for a diagnosis of sideroblastic anemia. If the patient is an adult, then the inherited form is more common than the other form. Diagnosis of a congenital can be delayed depending upon the type of compensation which the patient has. Clues from history and previous medical records should be taken into consideration. The therapy, regular or long term, should be taken into account. To rule out or rule in the possibility of micronutrient deficiency. The use of the alcohol, which might be excessive in certain patients, if falling within the toxic range, alcohol should be implicated as a cause in such cases. Ultimately, the clinical setting would define which of the laboratory tests would be performed. If a patient at all is more than 40 years, then a possibility of MDS should be considered. Again, I would like to emphasize that these are diagnoses of exclusion until and unless not proven otherwise. Deficiencies of copper and other micronutrients, excessive alcohol should be eliminated before labeling the patient as MDS. Exception here can be some of the commonly acquired mutation in that of cases of SF3B1 or that of JAK2, which often is there in MBS or MPN, which excludes the forms of congenital sideroblastic anemias. On the lab side of things, again, the smears, if at all available for review, should be reviewed. The platelet count would be increased if at all there is a hint of a myeloproliferative neoplasm in the case being studied. I've tried and summarized the various characteristics of the various indices which take place. Like for example, in hemoglobin, which has a variable presentation, like in autosomal recessive form implicated to the ABCB7 gene, the usual presentation would be less than 7 at the time of diagnosis. The RBC indices in majority would be low, microcytic hypochromic in majority of the non-syndromic forms. In the RBC morphology is striking in hyperphagocytosis and astrocytosis with demonstration of Pappenheimer bodies, which needs to be distinguished from the basophilic stippling. The reticulocyte in such patients would be normal to low, which is consistent with the associated
already discussed, ineffective erythropoiesis. Dyserythropoiesis includes left shift chromatin clumping, and it's associated in certain cellular markers with changes attributable by and demonstrable by flow cytometry. There can be cytoplasmic vacuolation, which can be there in the early myeloid erythroid precursors. However, if the vacuoles are there in the erythroid and myeloid precursors in all the stages, that differential diagnosis of copper deficiency should be considered. In the bone marrow, the ring sideroblasts are diagnostic hallmark of all the sideroblastic anemias. Exceptional cases of sideroblastic anemias with concomitant iron deficiencies most commonly encountered in young female in which there is an excess menstrual blood loss. The situation being relatively uncommon in the West, but relatively more common in our part of the world. Iron studies are concomitant with the iron deficiency state. Remember that not all the ring sideroblasts are detectable, and since the iron is leached out during the subsequent tissue processing which the sample goes through before we see it under a slide in the microscope. For the same reason, it's being debated nowadays that the biopsy when doing a marrow for a cytoblastic anemia, a biopsy is not necessary and not helpful and should not be done. Talking about the iron profile, serum ferritin typically increased in most of the sideroblastic anemias, which can be either clonal or non-clonal, and it's very difficult for them to be distinguished morphologically without doing a molecular or genetic testing. There can be variation of the amounts of erythrocyte protoporphyrin which can be there. For example, in X-linked sideroblastic anemia with linked in the transporter of the ABCP7, that is SLC25A38, low levels are formed uniformly in these patients. If associated with a syndrome, that is ataxia, then or an MDS or a clonal proliferation, and then in these two scenarios, the erythrocyte protoporphyrin are relatively increased. The copper level should be evaluated along with zinc levels whenever indicated. Without a molecular genetic testing, it is very difficult to put a specific pin on a specific diagnosis on the vast classification which we have discussed. I've tried and summarized the various mutations of the congenital sideroblastic anemias in the various classifications previously. The MDS with ring sideroblast mutations such as SF3B1 and JAK2V617 should be done. A differential diagnosis of should exclude other inherited and acquired anemias and common causes of microcytic anemias, that is iron deficiency, THAL, or anemia of chronic diseases. If in all there is a megaloblastic anemias, then like sideroblastic anemias, the presentation would be with anemia with reticulocytopenia. Some may or may not be associated with neurological findings, and they may be quite variable. Unlike the previously discussed sideroblastic anemia, the associations associated with megaloblastic changes if the diagnosis is pointing toward megaloblastic anemia. Sideroblasts in which the granules are cytosolic, they do not encircle the nucleus. That is, they will not be a ring sideroblast. If there is a vitamin B12 or folate deficiency, then should be subsequently tested. If there is a copper deficiency which is being suspected, then Wilson's disease should be ruled out by additionally testing for urinary copper excretion, which is high and diagnostic of Wilson's as opposed to sideroblastic anemias. In cases of lead poisoning, one can find heavy basophilic stippling, which may or may not, which may be associated with elevated blood levels when tested for. Other RBC inclusions like basophilic stippling should be excluded. In a few years ago, it was reported that a series of that the diagnosis of beta thalassemia was effectively delayed because the bone marrow examination documented ring sideroblast. However, in individuals with ring sideroblast who lack a congenital sideroblastic mutations or caused acquired sideroblastic anemia, one should parallelly test the patient for beta thalassemia, and a possibility of this diagnosis should be kept in mind. I'll try and summarize a few of the interesting cases for you. This case we reported last month, in which a 31-year-old gentleman who was a non-alcoholic but was working in a lead-based factory since 1 year presented to the hospital with complaints of pain, abdomen, and generalized weakness. On examination, he was pale and he had a slight degree of hepatomegaly, that is 2 fingers below the lower costal margin, on USG measuring up to 16 centimeter. The tip of the spleen was palpable, USG measurements being 12.6 centimeters. Subsequent the CBCs done show decreased hemoglobin, decreased platelet count, along with increased retic. The TLC in both the CBCs conducted was, however, normal. The serum transferrin saturation in this case was relatively low. The other parameters were relatively well within the normal limits. On the peripheral blood examination, we documented basophilic stippling, which was demonstrated, which was of the coarse type. Ultimately, on the Persian blue stain, 16% of sideroblasts, including 8% sideroblasts, were reported, with an impression of acquired sideroblastic anemia, possibly secondary to lead poisoning, and subsequently the lead levels were advised. There was also a case reported from our institute in which we reported a reversible myelosuppression with prolonged usage of linezolid in treatment with MRSA, that is methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus. In this, the 72-year-old, well-controlled hypertensive gentleman presented with shortness of breath, fatigue, and generalized weakness. The patient was hemodynamically stable. On performing the CBC, we found the hemoglobin along with the TLC and the platelet count to be decreased, that is pancytopenia, which became the primary indication for a bone marrow examination. On the LFTs, the AST and the ALT were relatively high, with the serum ferritin subsequently being high and to 1050 nanograms per ml. The other tests conducted were within normal limits. There was an inversion of ME ratio as 2:1, which was found. The diagnosis of MDS and acute leukemia was ruled out as we could not find any dysplastic cells or blast. The erythroid series was slightly depressed, with some of them showing vacuolations in certain stages. On doing a Persian blue stain, the bone marrow aspirate showing ring sideroblast and erythroid precursor was demonstrated in the Persian blue stain subsequently. Now, before ending and concluding, I would like to share with you, thanks to Anita ma'am, a case report which has recently published a few days ago. If you do not suspect the unsuspected, you will not recognize when it advised. So despite being discussed and us discussing the entire spectrum in which the sideroblast, normal, abnormal, or ring might be found, recently a case was reported in a 72-year-old male presenting with anemia and bilateral lower limb edema for 2 months. Anemia had been noted since a period of 5 years that was chronic, that is, it was chronic in nature. CT highlighted and reported splenomegaly. Bone marrow showed predominance of granulocytic series with grade 2 reticulin fibers. This was the original published report. Ultimately, a diagnosis of chronic neutrophilic leukemia was conducted after a molecular tests, and hence ring sideroblasts were demonstrated effectively in a case of chronic neutrophilic leukemia, which has not been reported previously before. So to conclude, the sideroblastic anemias are a heterogeneous group of disorders which can be inherited or acquired. Understanding the metabolism of iron at molecular level leads to a better understanding of its pathophysiology. The carrier detection can be done in the affected families, and genetic counseling can be done whenever indicated. Genetic counseling and antenatal diagnosis will be able to prevent the incidence rate of sideroblastic anemias in the subsequent coming future. With this, I end my slideshow and I hand over the podium to Nadeem sir again.
Thank you, Dr. Saurav. Excellent presentation, very crisp and very clear. The content was very good, and you have really explained the entire sideroblastic anemia from the basics till case presentation and your publication. Very well done. Very clear in your comprehension of the subject as well as in your delivery of the topic. Very well done. Excellent job.
Thank you, sir.
Very
Thank you, sir.
nice. I think we would invite you again to speak on some other topic. Very nicely done. Excellent.
Definitely, sir.
As a protocol, I
highly
would request you. Yeah, please. Sorry. Go ahead.
sorry, sir. I'm just about to thank you and Anita ma'am for providing me with this wonderful opportunity, sir, of interacting with my seniors and my juniors and my peers and on such a platform, sir. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. The pleasure is all ours. And I would request you to share the PDF of your lecture so that we can upload it on the Google Drive for everybody to view and learn from that. This is a wonderful lecture which you have taken. God bless you. Right,
Thank
we
you,
will
sir.
end it here. Thank you so much. Take care. Bye bye.
Thank you, sir.
Thanks. Bye.